Alrighty, we will get going. So this is start here, Kubernetes for mere mortals, which really means this is for people who have never taken a look at Kubernetes, or for people who are just getting started. This is really, taking what I've done in the documentation of my journey for Kubernetes, and hopefully this is a new take for you if you're getting started with it, and maybe it'll give you something to focus on to actually learn it faster, which is really the main point of what I'm doing here. So very quickly, our agenda for today, I don't know that this is going to go, it's probably not going to go the full hour, which you may appreciate actually. I timed this probably 40 minutes tops, but if you have any questions after the fact, then definitely that'll be a good place to ask them. So speaker introduction, a little bit about me, because a lot of the journey that I have with Kubernetes has inspired this very talk. I am all about expectations and disclaimers, what you will and won't know at the end of this. So I want to make sure that we level set on what we're doing here. And this is really a things I wish I was told before I started Kubernetes talk. So I'm really taking all of the learning and all of the journey that I've had, and I'm boiling it down into, if somebody had just told me to concentrate on these particular things, I would have learned it a lot faster. Because with my background coming into Kubernetes, I was like, I want to learn all the things and I want to learn them all right now. And Kubernetes, with the moving parts that you have there, that can be overwhelming for a lot of people. I even know a lot of people who are more well-versed in tech than I was. And it was like a real brute force thing where you just had to keep focusing in on it, keep doing it until just something clicked. That's kind of how most people's journeys go. So I want to make sure that we talk about those particular things. And they are as follows. Learning and knowing that Kubernetes is a data center in a box. Way back in 2011, that was my first VMworld. 2011 was all about the software-defined data center. Remember that? And Kubernetes is really sort of that on steroids, as it were. I know I don't want to get too down the weeds of like what really defines a software-defined data center, but Kubernetes is really a software-defined API that provides a data center in the box. And once I framed it that way, a lot easier to learn it. Next one is Bash, or I use Z Shell, that's just me, and what we would call a hierarchical CLI, and knowing what those things mean. And I'll have nice tiny little mini lessons coming up. Containers, container images, container repos, and container networking. A lot of you might be looking at that and saying, that's like a whole class in itself, Brian. Yes, yes, it is. So I say this one because there are a lot of people who may have never built a container independently of Kubernetes and start Kubernetes without getting that portion of it, or doing containers on their own. And it can be a heavy lift because really all Kubernetes, well, I shouldn't say all Kubernetes does, but it's a container orchestrator. So understanding how containers work under the hood is super important, especially when it comes to stuff like, I don't know, troubleshooting. JSON and YAML. I hear everybody's eye roll now with that topic. But one of the advantages I had coming into Kubernetes is that I did a lot of work in Ansible. Ansible is defined through YAML, sometimes JSON, depending on what you're doing. So I found that knowing that going in helped me out tremendously. And then applications concepts. Once upon a time, I was an admin, so I did a lot of running lots of different web servers, and those applications concepts can help you if you've previously done that. So those are really the 5 things that if you know these 5 things, then Kubernetes is going to be much easier for you. Another passing topic that I plan on sort of demystifying Kubernetes a little later through REST APIs, knowing REST APIs and how they work. Super important. And a couple of tools that are required for that really is Postman and or curl. Somebody mentioned Postman earlier. Kudos. And I'm going to have a demo. Now, I usually film my demos just in case, but we'll see if the demo gods are working in my favor today. And I'm going to do a very basic demo and show you some of these concepts and bring some of those home, like the data center in a box in Bash and JSON YAML and all that cool jazz. And then also, I have a resources list for you that goes beyond this talk. I have a tech blog, thinkingoutcloud.org. So I want to make sure that, hey, if you want to go beyond what I'm showing you here, I'm available there, and you can certainly do that. And then also, I've uploaded all of the code that I use for the demo up to my GitHub. So there you have it. So very quickly, who am I? I love information technology, Russian literature, mechanical keyboards, and cats. That is not my boat. Just thought it was a good picture of me, so I kept it. There's day 77 of COVID, of everybody being locked down and everything. These two are pictures of my cat, Percy. That's my old mechanical keyboard. I have a new one now. And then one of my favorite books of all time is Notes from Underground. Originally, my IT career started with being a tech trainer. And for about 3 years, between 2009 and 2012-ish, I taught official VMware content. I was VCI certified, vSphere or VMware certified instructor. I made the switch over to Dell. That is where I really switched over from training into doing it for realsies. I started my automation journey. Automation is really kind of my jam. There, we had a fairly large infrastructure as a service healthcare cloud that Dell owned at the time. I have no idea if they still own it. Probably not. Pretty large environment, which means that we really had to start automating all the things. So that's where I got started with. I made my first container back in 2014, which scared me to death at the time. And other tools, Git, PowerCLI, and Ansible. And now I work for a large retailer that is not Amazon. Principal systems engineer. My main two responsibilities are VMware infrastructure and automation, and Kubernetes. That's coming up here. Automation journey continues there. I am infrastructure as code focused, and I'm responsible for Kubernetes, PowerCLI, Ansible, Git, Terraform, Jenkins, blah, blah, blah. I started my IT blog in February 2020. The month before, that was in the before times. And I started that with the intention of doing in-person talks. So it's nice to be here. And I am a vExpert starting last year. And I am also cloud practitioner certified with AWS recently. So very quickly, one brief aside, I'm currently learning the drums. I'm having this aside because this is talking about what inspired me to present this in this way. And there were a lot of things that people didn't tell me about learning the drums. For example, because I plan on doing a lot of like heavy metal drumming. I'm a big metalhead. And one of the things that I was told through my various online training and whatnot is that you're going to have to spend a lot of time doing some very tedious things, like focusing on your non-dominant hand speed, because you can only drum as fast as your non-dominant hand. And I sort of kind of knew that. But there are some drills that you can do. And over here, it has like these drills that you're just focusing on that one thing on the snare drum. I wanted to get to the drum kit, which I just bought for Christmas, and I wanted to just like start drumming, and it doesn't work that way. You have to focus on things, and once you focus on those things, it makes everything else fall into place. The faster you are on the snare drum, the faster you'll be on everything else that you're hitting with the drumstick. So these drills are like super tedious, like left, left, right, 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 left, left, and so on. I'm not saying that learning Kubernetes is tedious, but I am saying that there are things that you need to focus on, and I'm here to talk to you about them when it comes to Kubernetes. So That's the idea of this entire talk. With Kubernetes, you focus on the right things, you'll learn it faster. Otherwise, it can be overwhelming. Again, hey, I want to learn how all the networking works. Let's focus on some other things first, and then that'll fall into place. Usual disclaimer I have, I'm not a this is not a vendor presentation. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I don't favor or advocate one vendor over another, and my opinions are my own. I say all those things because I don't want VMware or the anonymous company I work for coming back or anybody going and reporting me for saying things. Although I should be on my best, I am on my best behavior here. My other usual disclaimer for every talk that I give is that this is a method for learning Kubernetes, not the method. I don't proclaim that this is the way you have to do it. I am simply sharing my journey with you, and hopefully some things will speak to you and maybe some things will stick, but I just found that concentrating on these things will allow for you to learn it a lot faster. To start here, introduction, which means that if you are a Kubernetes guru, you might get something out of it. I don't know. I do have some advanced resources and a few tools listed later that you might want to try, but I just want to make sure we level set and understand that I'm speaking to people who may not, have dealt with Kubernetes or are just getting started. And like I said before, this is a I wish I'd told me that talk. This is to give you areas of focus so you can expedite your own learning. And of course, you won't be a humble Kubernetes guru at the end of this, but it is a great start, or so I hope. And another thing you might be thinking at the end of this, like, he didn't really talk about networking or storage. I am purposefully not talking about those two things. And again, I want to make sure this is very clear. I am not saying that networking or persistent storage are not important. They very much are. But those two topics alone can be pretty overwhelming when you are trying to learn Kubernetes, right? So, I instead really kind of like giving up sort of a spoiler alert of this entire thing. Do something simple first based on Kubernetes infrastructure. Sort of be okay with the defaults is really kind of the saying that I can say with this. And then the networking and persistent storage are things that you can get into later. If you go in and you start learning about containers, like you start taking a class on containers before you get into the more Kubernetes oriented learning, you're going to learn about networking because a lot of the networking is based on the container provider, right? So keep in mind that a lot of that stuff will come with as sort of a piggyback on these things that I'm having you focus on. So the realms of knowledge, and I know this is a bit repetitious because I brought this up a little bit earlier, but the title really of this could be 5 things to concentrate on to speed up your Kubernetes learning. Understand data center compute roles and distributed computing. The advantage I have here is that I started out as a data center rack and stack person. I racked and stacked. That's what I did. Then I moved on and up to, okay, we've got to implement this application in a redundant way. All right, so we need, a cluster of, web servers, for example. We need a load balancer. We need storage provided, and we need top of rack switches for all of this to interconnect, stuff like that. Bash in the hierarchical CLI, containers, and everything about them. Again, I have a lesson on what to concentrate on containers, but out of all of these, that's probably, if you've never dealt with containers before, that's probably the heaviest lift because a lot of what I'm talking about is interconnected with that. When you create a Docker image, for example, it's really a series of bash commands. So all of these are focused in interrelated topics to help you learn faster. But that's probably going to be the one you concentrate on the most. That's the tedious, snare drum practice is the container one there. JSON YAML and application concepts, and we'll come back to these, but these are the 5 things to concentrate on. Things that will help you if you already know how REST APIs work going into this will be a lot easier. There are a lot of free classes on a lot of these things I'm talking about as well. And there's Postman curl making their appearance again. And then infrastructure as code concepts, Git, Ansible, Terraform, etc. There are some Kubernetes management tools like Rancher out there, which is fine, and that's great. That's actually what we use where I work. that has a UI there. But in reality, if you really want to do this in a repeatable, standardized, and easy way, you typically automate the process of building clusters and whatnot. So those are all things that will help, and that's kind of like your next steps, right? So data center in a box. I wanted to avoid defining Kubernetes because just depending on where I was in my Kubernetes journey, I took a lot of intro to Kubernetes classes. This is my take on that, I guess. But I just remember going through all those classes and I'm like, if I see one more definition of Kubernetes. But here's the one that is relevant for me. This is the one that kind of allowed for me to wrap my brain around it. And this is a little reworded from the official definition from the Kubernetes website, which is Kubernetes leverages well-known software-defined data center concepts such as clustered nodes and load balancing, but rolls it all up into an easy-use API for rapid automated development and deployment of applications. That is a mouthful. But what I mean by that is that if you take the physical data center, and this is probably a topic that you may be used to with like your sort of software-defined data center, software-defined networking, software-defined everything topics. If you take what we would typically have in a physical data center, you have your physical compute nodes. You have your, I don't know if the arrow's showing up or not, but you have your top of rack switches. You just look at the screen there. You have your storage, and you have your load balancer, right? So let's say this is a clustered web application, right? You have your physical compute nodes, you have your physical load balancer, you have your physical firewall, physical top of rack switches, and your physical storage of whatever type. Storage could be SAN storage. If you're using vSAN, then that would be sort of the HCI approach, right? But in reality, what do we have with Kubernetes? Well, all of that could be on one machine. So really, there's this overlay of this square around that. The physical infrastructure could be one machine. I wouldn't recommend running this all on one machine in production. But all of that, that's what I mean by a data center in the box. Instead of the top of rack switches, we have the container network interface, those known as the CNI. You have instead your Kubernetes nodes, which then run your pods, which then quite honestly run your containers. And then you have your Kubernetes storage class providing what we would call persistent storage. And they even use a lot of the same vocabulary for the load balancer. In the physical world, we call it a load balancer. In Kubernetes, we call it a load balancer. And then, of course, we have a firewall, which is in the form of security policies. And you also have IP tables, which is imposed in a lot of different places in Kubernetes. So framing it this way, I think made a lot of sense for me. Granted, yes, I had some data center experience before, but you know, once I started training internally to a lot of our VMware people, they sort of understood this concept because VMware people typically understand this. So like if you want to translate this into, okay, here's my ESXi hosts, you can do that if you want, if it makes it easier for you. But that's the conceptual idea of Kubernetes. And if you have multiple clusters, and as far as like thinking about, okay, well, I want to make this stuff redundant, well, you can have physical nodes, Kubernetes nodes, if you're doing what's referred to as bare metal Kubernetes, or you can do Kubernetes across VMs, which is pretty common also, especially for using like VMware Tanzu, and which I highly recommend, by the way. Bash or Z Shell, this goes out to Windows admins who really want to get started with Kubernetes and running Kubernetes. There are multiple classes on Linux commands, many for free. Some examples are cat, more, less, grep, JQ, which is a JSON parsing tool, which is pretty common. Knowing I came into this knowing Bash as well, because once upon a time I was a Linux admin before I jumped into the VMware thing. It was a command line called kubectl. Is everybody still seeing my screen? Just making sure.
Yep.
I had a glitch in the matrix over here. Okay, cool. For Kubernetes, of course, you'll use kubectl. And as of right now, this is a requirement. UI tools are not robust enough to do all the things. Now, I mentioned Rancher earlier. There are others out there. And it's a great tool, don't get me wrong. But as Kubernetes admins, we find ourselves using kubectl still a lot. Especially in troubleshooting situations. I will. I went out on a limb with that bullet. So if there's somebody out there who knows like a UI tool that does all the things without having to use kubectl, I actually want to know. I'd love to see that. Now, kubectl is also hierarchical, and what we mean by that is you have something simple like kubectl get, which is a pretty common command, versus something like kubectl describe. And the way hierarchical commands work is if you type in kubectl get and press enter, it's going to say, what do you want to get? So it'll actually list off the next part of the command, right? Versus kubectl describe and press enter, that will be different things. So each sub command that you type in is going to have another set of options underneath that. This is what's called a hierarchical command line interface, which is pretty common. Cisco uses it, stuff like that. So it's just something that you can get used to. The good news about hierarchical command lines is that typically if you type in the first two things like kubectl get and then press enter, it's typically harmless and it will just say, okay, well, what do you want to do? So that's the good news. The downside is that you sometimes have to be careful with stuff like, I don't know, kubectl delete. So there are a lot of things that, once you understand that, it makes things a lot easier. And I've found that if I sort of let people in on this, it makes it a lot easier for them. Containerization, Captain Obvious makes an appearance. Kubernetes is a container orchestrator. Therefore, knowing how containers are built and how they run is a must. Out of all the things that we've talked about, I would recommend highly that you concentrate. Remember my analogy of the snare drum practice. Knowing the more you know about containers, the faster you'll be able to pick up Kubernetes as a whole, because that's what Kubernetes does. And furthermore, how to build containers is also going to be very advantageous. A lot of times as a Kubernetes infrastructure person, which is where I'm at on this journey, knowing how to build containers is becoming more and more common. And here are some use cases, wink, wink, salespeople. Kubernetes pods with Jenkins. The way we run Jenkins is Jenkins jobs are run in a Kubernetes pod that is put together by people consuming that particular Jenkins infrastructure. So rather than having Jenkins run either as a single entity, which is quite honestly pretty hard to maintain, what people do who are using that Jenkins infrastructure is they will create their own Kubernetes pods that are self-contained and all their stuff runs in there. We do this all the time. Ansible, I have a couple of Power CLI ones that run independently in Kubernetes pods. And that means that I've got to build my own, which I do. And you also have, and again, these are things from my world. We use Ansible quite a bit. We also use another tool related to that called AWX, which is the quote unquote, emphasis in the quotes, free version of Ansible Tower. It's the dev version. And they have switched to execution environments, which run as pods in Kubernetes. Rather than running as VMs within the actual AWX. Again, the power behind this, and this is kind of the idea, is that the execution environment is maintained by the person consuming AWX. Before that, you had to have the VM actually injected and set on the AWX machine. So if there was a change, then the admin had to go in and change that on the server. Here with execution environments, all you have to do is maintain the uptime of AWX as the admin, and then the devs or whoever's consuming that can create their own pods and off they go, or create their own container images. Harbor is a private repo for your pods and containers, really containers. That's a recommended piece of knowledge to have. Harbor's not the only one out there, but it's kind of the common one, especially if you're using Docker. Docker's the focus here. It doesn't have to be. As far as like container images, there are others out there. And as far as building Docker anything, the demystifying of that is that Docker build is a series of bash commands. Hey, it comes back around. Remember the bash thing we talked about earlier? JSON YAML. Outputs and inputs with Kubernetes are in JSON YAML. There are tools that'll interpret or obfuscate those. Rancher is one, but I found knowing these are a requirement, especially for troubleshooting. Here's a very simple example, and YAML is all about spaces, not tabs. Right. There's by the way, that's taken straight from the Kubernetes website and its documentation. And like I said, I had an advantage of working with YAML before I got into Kubernetes, but it's yet another thing to concentrate on that will make your learning faster elsewhere. Because, okay, here's an example. All right, so Bryan, you say let's focus on these 5 things, and now I do want to go into learning about persistent storage. Well, how is persistent storage defined? Particularly if you're going to put it into Kubernetes, it's defined through YAML. So all of these different things that I'm talking about are really interrelated. Applications concepts. I call it old school, but it's really still the way things are done in the more traditional implementations. When you have a single web server, let's call it Nginx, say it's an Nginx web server, how is that accessed, especially if you're doing co-location? So you're co-locating a bunch of websites on one particular web server. Each one of those websites can be differentiated by port, by subdirectory, or by header, right? I know these are, if you've never dealt with web services before, that's probably, it's new to you. But even as an infrastructure person, I'm not a dev, but we do actually drink our own champagne where I work, and we infrastructure people also run our own application layer stuff in Kubernetes, like Jenkins, like AWX, right? And knowing and understanding how stuff is co-located on a web server will help you tremendously, because it's a related way to the way Kubernetes does it. Understanding ports and protocols, 100% something that you need to learn. And I guess if you are, looking at your Twitter feed, at least focus in on this, because these are the 5 pieces of vocabulary also that are the first things I would recommend learning about Kubernetes if you haven't so far, right? 5 things. A pod, what is that? And it's just a housing for a container or containers, plural. The deployment, which is a redundant pod or a set of multiple pods. A service, which describes the application infrastructure. It's the pod and container info, and therefore defining how that deployment can be accessed externally. Ingress, which allows access to web apps. Think of that as a quote unquote firewall, emphasis on the quotes, but really related to just web apps. And then the load balancer. Those 5 things alone. This is 80%. I would say as a Kubernetes admin, this is 80% of what I deal with. Sure, networking is stuff I deal with. Sure, persistent storage is stuff I deal with. But I would say that as far as implementation and troubleshooting, these are the things that are the most common that we run into. And learning those 5 things first, I think, helps tremendously. Knowing REST APIs and how they work, I can't recommend enough Postman. Knowing curls, sure. If you're adept at the bash command line, but Postman, I could not do my job without Postman. I can't tell you how many times I've had to go into Postman, and it's a great tool for initially connecting to APIs and being able to very quickly switch up and say, oh, I guess I had the wrong token or whatever. A lot of times I do a lot of just like get so I can actually connect to the API. And then once I know how to do that in Postman, then I can do that programmatically, right? Super awesome tool. And as you may well know, you can access the Kubernetes API directly. And if you want to learn how Kubernetes really works, I don't know. Again, this is like a visual thing for me. I'm a visual person. Going into Postman and connecting, which I'm going to do as part of the demo, fingers crossed, it allowed for me to see, oh, okay, that's the hierarchy, the way Kubernetes is set up, because the REST APIs are of course, hierarchical in nature. And then I can see the JSON output of each one of those particular objects. And it helped me to get an idea of what components really are part of Kubernetes, and allowed for me to, see things from a more holistic view. And that's not an exhaustive list, by the way. But these are the ones that people learn typically first in the Kubernetes API. All right, here we go. Let's see if the demo gods are in my favor. I've switched over to my terminal. Everybody able to see that too? Yes? Everybody?
Yeah, I can see it.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I'm using a, actually, what are we doing in the demo? Almost forgot that. We're using MiniCube. MiniCube is a great tool for dev purposes. MiniCube allows for you to run Kubernetes on your local machine. It is mostly a dev tool, and it's a great tool to learn the basics. As far as like learning how to do things at scale or in the enterprise, it's not a great tool. I'll say that right now. But as far as like, hey, I've got this running locally on my machine and I have everything all in one place, it is a great tool for that, and great for demos as well. We're going to create a simple Nginx deployment and make it accessible. We're going to do some basic kubectl commands. And then also we'll take a look at the resultant JSON YAML as a result. So just so you know, there aren't any tricks up my sleeve. This is from the demo that I have available in GitHub. I scripted out a very simple MiniCube setup. And that MiniCube setup has two major things outside of the actual Kubernetes infrastructure. I've flagged it to install Ingress, and I've flagged it to install Metal LB as a load balancer. Now, again, these are things that people didn't tell me when I learned Kubernetes, which is a more enterprise, or the enterprise methodology for providing access to pods and nodes and whatnot within Kubernetes. We do this through Ingress, and we do this through a load balancer, right? Ingress is provided through MiniCube, has this built in, and then you also have Metal LB built in. When you are learning, on a side note, there is another sort of piece of learning you can do called Kubernetes the hard way. You may have heard of it. Maybe you've done it. I recommend highly that you do that. As a matter of fact, I decided to do that. The very first thing I did was Kubernetes the hard way, and I don't regret it. I think I should do it again just for like the learning purposes, to bring things home. But in MiniCube, and you're seeing this more and more nowadays, like for example in Tanzu, where the ingress and load balancing is baked into the cake. Right, each different flavor or vendor provided Kubernetes has like, okay, here's the ingress that we use. Here's the load balancer that we use. The ingress that we're using is an ingress that is based on Nginx, I think. Yeah, ingress Nginx. And then the load balancer we're using is Metal LB. So for this demo, I just went ahead and say, go ahead and install MiniCube. It's cool. But it is something I would recommend for you to do manually so you understand the inner workings of it. And you do that. How do you do that? You do that through YAML and whatnot, right? I have also served out the Kubernetes API through the local host, and that's another MiniCube thing. You can also do this on a production level Kubernetes, or at least you can connect to it through the API IP address for the Kubernetes API itself. But I've made it available here. That's kind of just a MiniCube thing, but the concept is still the same. So as of right now, if we take a look at starting out this, I haven't built the deployment yet. So this 127.00.18080, that's the port, and we're going to be running this locally, of course, of this deployment that I'm about to set up here. So the first command to set that up, and again, this is straight out of the documentation on Kubernetes, on the Kubernetes website. And if you want the link to this, I can give this to you. We're using an inline deployment rather than doing this through YAML, right? So we're saying, go ahead and create the deployment. We're doing a really simple one. The image is actually defining the container image that I'm using for this. And this is coming from the Kubernetes repo, right? So that's the container that I'm building my deployment off of. And remember, a deployment is a pod or a set of pods. So that's been created. Awesome. The next thing I need to do is I need to make this available as a service. So in the inline methodology for doing this, you would do this as a what's called a kubectl expose in this case. And this makes it available. So it's one thing to create it, but I need to make it available. And that's another kind of multiple step process that nobody really told me as I was going in and learning Kubernetes. So that is exposed as a service. That is something that we talked about earlier. And now that we have the deployment created and we have the ingress in, we have the load balancer in, and now we have the service created, we should see that load here. Thank goodness that worked. I did this like 100 times and make sure it works. But yes, this is indicating that, okay, we are actually serving out the application through Nginx. It's available now. It's available through all of the various infrastructure that we've literally set up through that. Last command, I want to do a kubectl get. This is going to get the deployment of hello minikube 1 in this case. And -o is output. I want to output this in YAML. So this is bringing home a lot of those things that we've talked about previously. And there you have it. This is very, very common. This, as far as like, okay, hey, what do Kubernetes admins do? Well, especially in troubleshooting situations, they're going to be doing a lot of this. Kubectl describe is another one that they use, that we use a lot of. But, you know, metadata annotations. Further down, they tell you what the image is or the container is, right? So this is the container that's running, right? So, so there's that. And then the last thing is looking at this visually through Postman. So this is on a different port, 8001 in this case. And here we can visually see, I'm just doing pods here in this case. I can see what pods are created. Here's the one we literally just created as part of the deployment, the hello minikube one. It's brand new to the Kubernetes API. This is literally looking at everything that, well, at least the pods in this case. We can also just, back off a little bit and we can see all of the different resources, which is what the way it's referred to in Kubernetes. And we can see, well, everything. We can see config maps, we can see endpoints, we can see events, which is kind of the logging, right? Namespaces, which is something I haven't really talked about in this talk, but that's another sort of aspect that you'll learn through Kubernetes itself, which is the organization of all these various clusters and whatnot. So I think, I don't know, this is something that really helped me. I hadn't seen really people show the actual API, but I think it really helps to bring stuff home as to how Kubernetes actually works. Resources available after this. Shameless plug for my blog also, I guess. But I wrote a 5-part Kubernetes series, which is how I learned Kubernetes. And for me, it was pretty common. I shared a lot of things with some of the other even more, seasoned Linux admins that I a lot of my Linux admin buddies. It can be overwhelming, and a lot of times it's just you just have to keep learning and learning and learning and learning, taking classes until it just clicks. In part 2 of that, I list off all of the things that I studied, all of the things that I went through that finally led to my breakthrough. And the one thing that I cannot recommend enough is Kubernetes in Action. This is the one book for me, which also has a repo with scripts in it. That's the one that really just kind of brought stuff home, and it started to click, and I started to get it because it went through and did, those 5 things I just mentioned. And quite honestly, a lot of what I'm telling you here is inspired by that. The 5 different, major things to talk about, or the 5 different major things to focus on, went through all of those: pod, deployment, service, ingress, load balancer. All of those things were really sort of covered first in all of that, and very simple YAML files that allowed for you to create that pretty quickly in pretty much any Kubernetes environment. It was really nice. And also on top of that, all of it worked, which is also a plus. Some of the tools we talked about, we've got MiniCube. The first quote unquote real Kubernetes implementation I did is Tanzu Kubernetes Grid in the community edition. I don't think it was called that because this was a while back at the time, but the community edition is free. And that is really a much more quote unquote real world implementation, where you see how, okay, you're using a VM template to build it. You have to bootstrap the actual cluster. You will start looking at things like cluster API and whatnot, which is the way Tanzu Kubernetes Grid is implemented. And that's where I sort of got my real introduction to more real world Kubernetes. I recommend it highly. Docker, kubectl, and then there are a couple of tools that I use, which is kubectx and kubeNS. I didn't really cover those in the demo, but those are tools you can use to very quickly switch between Kubernetes clusters, or what is referred to in Kubernetes as contexts, because you typically are responsible, or at least we are, for multiple different contexts or multiple different clusters. So being able to switch very quickly through using something like kubectx and kubeNS is the same kind of concept, but switching between namespaces, which is also pretty common if you're an admin. So yeah, if you have any questions, I am at Russian Lit Guy on the Twitter, or there's my personal email, brian.sullins@gmail.com. Thank you. And any questions?